everyone. Thank you all for joining. I'm honored to be here with you all this time. My name is Matthew Brassard. I am the head of marketing and growth at Ground News. And by a show of hands, who here is a Ground News reader? All right, that's OK. I should do a bit better job, but that's fine. Maybe next year, you'll all be readers. So for those of you who don't know, Ground News is a news comparison platform that allows you to compare what multiple sources are saying about any story. We're based in Kitchener, Ontario. For those of you who don't know, it's about an hour and a half west of Toronto in Canada, for those of you who are familiar with our geography. I was actually the 5th employee at Ground News back when I was a freshman at university. That's my headshot then. Haven't gotten a new one since, so that's why it's still there. And today I'm here to discuss how our approach to news can keep the world well informed while still upholding to free speech principles. So the current state of news is quite chaotic. We have a major US election in 3 weeks, multiple wars. So before I kind of go into the current moment and why we're here, I kind of want to bring it back a long time to 1440. Those of you who may be more news nerds like myself will know that this is the year of the invention of the printing press. This ushered in a massive change culturally. The scientific revolution, the European Renaissance, this changed how we communicate as a society. Fast forward a few more hundred years, the invention of the machine-powered printing press. This gave rise to what we know now to be the daily paper. Example of that is the Delaware Gazette, which is actually still a paper today. These papers more reported on the hard political news of the day and were mostly given in locals. Quickly, that gave rise to the penny press, which, as the name suggests, is newspaper printed on a cheaper broadsheet. The difference, though, is these papers covered more stories of scandal and murder and adventure rather than the hard, dry political news. So in a way, they were kind of the first version of clickbait. After that, the powers that be kind of saw the immense sway that these papers held. So there started to be explicitly partisan newspapers. Example of that being the St. Louis Globe-Democrat, a paper that at the time exclusively carried Democratic talking points. So really the idea of clickbait and bias in news isn't exactly new, as was the problem in the 1800s. Fast forward a few hundred years, the invention of the radio. This really changed, again, how we see the world, as the radio was a way that we could communicate without the logistical restrictions of newsprint and the demands that come with that. Next, we have the invention of the TV, around 40 years after that. TVs are in the house of every American, but the relative high cost of TV production meant that Americans still had a low choice of what they could see on TV, as most content was created by 3 corporations, which may sound familiar. Fast forward 40 more years, CNN really changed this by ushering in the advent of the 24-hour news cycle, which still remains with us today. The advent of the internet made it even faster. There's 3 major eras of the internet. The first era is called the Web 1 era. This was mostly read-only. So you would go online, you would read the news, you wouldn't really participate. And because of this and the relative slow joining of most news sites to the internet, there actually was relatively little choice of what to read in the early days of the internet beyond a few sites and a few blogs. After that, we had the social media era of the internet. This was the more innocent version where you'd go on Facebook and you would see stories that either your friends would share or pages that you chose to follow explicitly would share. Which brings us to where we are today, which I call the age of the algorithm. The algorithm is all-powerful in a way that it can often determine if you're hired, if you're fired, how much you're paid, and fundamentally changes the way that we see the world and ourselves. So just to show how much this has changed the sources we know and sources we trust, I want to walk through get a little experiment here. So the rulers of the Web 2 era, which are widely seen as Facebook and Twitter, let's look at what news sources were followed the most. So what are the biggest news sources on this platform? And then we'll also go through the current most followed news source on the king of the current era, which is TikTok. So in your heads, try to guess. I guarantee you will all be wrong, but you can try. Which sources were the most followed? So first, on Facebook, with 63 million followers, we have BBC. a news source you should all know and you may trust. On Twitter, with 60 million followers, a news source you also may know and may trust, CNN. And on TikTok, with 13 million followers, is News Daddy. So just like how much this algorithm has changed how we trust and see the news is immense in ways that we haven't yet seen, or that we are seeing now. So how we get our news has changed radically, but I'd argue that we as people haven't. And this has led to some bad outcomes. This chart was from Gallup, it was actually recently reported, but trust in media, all-time low, not really a new headline. But as you can see, it really has increased since the algorithm age, especially in independents and conservatives. Well, it still is kind of flat for Democrats, but it is dropping. And while Americans do value the role of media in democracy, they are losing faith of it as a neutral operator. So here's kind of where we come in. Ground News was founded in 2018 by Harlan Carr. She was a former NASA engineer that worked on the New Horizons mission to Pluto. She worked in space for a while, mostly in satellites. And she again had this epiphany when she was working in Europe at this company, where she realized that we could see pipes that were leaking from space. So we had this like godlike technology, but we can't agree on body cam footage or what's in the news. So there was this disconnect in, again, the immense power that we wield as a species, but also the way that we argue seemed to be getting worse. The Ground started as a way to address a simple problem. We see way too much content, way too fast. And also the question that sparked that is, why do I have to read 10 different news sites and have 10 different tabs open to get a stronger view, to get a full view of what's happening in the news? So at first, again, it was about collecting multiple articles and putting them in one place so you'd get a fuller view of what's happening. But as an engineer-led company, we wanted to see what data can we give readers so they can better contextualize the news they see. So we chose 3 primary vectors. The first one is political bias. So from a far left to a far right, every news source on Ground News has a political bias rating. Secondly, factuality, which looks at the reporting history of a news source as a whole, not on an article level. It looks at stuff like retractions, headline, choices of words in headlines, that kind of thing. Lastly is ownership. It's who owns the news source, what's the category, are they government owned, are they independent, are they owned by a media conglomerate, that kind of thing. These ratings come from 3 agencies that they're not made by us. They're done by All Sides, Ad Fontes, and Media Bias Fact Check, for those of you who know those companies. And here's how it looks on the site. So when you go on Ground News and you go into any story, you can see, for example, Breitbart, owned by Larry Solov, has a mixed factuality history reporting and has a right bias. Axios, same story, owned by Cox Media, has a high factuality rating and also has a lean left bias. So putting these headlines together creates what we call split headlines, which are massive discrepancies in how a story is covered. Example, recent story, Toyota recently rolled back their DEI initiatives. If you read this story from the left point of view, you would think, okay, this was done because of like one really strong conservative activist. But if you saw it from the right, you may think, oh, this was done to prioritize employees' skills and stuff. So what headline you see has a massive change on how you may interpret and see a story. Recently, with the war in Gaza, this has kind of come to a bigger head. So this is a story of a recent event there. As you can see, the coverage from Al Jazeera, NPR, the Times of Israel, all has a massive difference in how the story is covered. Like, for example, who was killed? Was it gunmen? Was it Palestinians? Was it terrorists? Each source kind of has a different point of view. So if you just saw one of these sources, one of these headlines in isolation, you would have a massive different interpretation of what's happening in the world. This leads to our next feature and kind of our calling card of Ground News called News Blind Spots. It isn't really a new concept, but it's kind of been made a lot worse by the era of the algorithm. News blind spots are stories that are disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum. For example, the story about school teachers told to pass migrants in Chicago was a story that was just covered by sources on the right. So if you lean left, you may have not seen the story in your news feed. If you lean right, you probably would have. Opposite side, big story, California is suing Exxon, claiming the oil giant to deceive the public about plastic. If you leaned right, you may have not seen the story in the newsfeed, or if you leaned left, you probably would have. So news blind spots, in a way, can explain partially how we can have such a different understanding of reality from people who have different beliefs. Because a lot of time, if you spend news a lot of time online, especially on these algorithm-powered feeds, you kind of are in a way. And reading blind spots is a way to step into the news reality of the other and kind of understand and have a chance to walk a mile in somebody else's news. So we can only do this effectively if we have a large variety of news sources. Ground News is actually the world's biggest news platform in terms of content. We have more news articles on the site than Google News, than Apple News, countries the size of small countries. But this includes sources that are currently banned in large swaths of the world, including RT, InfoWars, Press TV, Al Jazeera, Sputnik. And I'll kind of walk into why I do this later, but first I want to walk through a quick story. So this choice to have these sources on Ground News has been challenged a few times. The first being the war in Ukraine. 3 months after the war, the EU and the UK banned RT from the airwaves in their countries. Did this ban work? Not really. 2 years after the ban, you could still actually access these sites in the same building in the EU in Brussels where it was banned. So despite this, we chose to keep the sources on our platform, but with context. So if you go on Ground News and you see any story from RT, you can see they're funded by the government of Russia, they have a low factuality rating, and they lean right. And for those of you here, I think I'm talking to mostly a bunch of news nerds here, but this isn't apparent to everyone. There is a large portion of the population who does not know who these sources are, what they stand for, who they're funded by, so if they encounter these sources in their own life, they may not know what it means. Now, I'll be honest with you, we don't have these sources in Ground News because we think that they're fearless truth tellers or that all points of view on the war are equal or that Press TV and InfoWars practice fact-based reporting, because they don't. Despite this, we don't believe the solution is to hide sources and pretend they don't exist. As you can see here, and as you may know, we're currently experiencing a huge crisis in trust. Most Americans do not trust institutions or each other. And often in this kind of society, telling people to not trust a certain source can often inspire a reactionary lurch to actually trust that source. We have to ask, well, what about misinfo, which is a valid concern in today's world. As you can see, a lot of people feel a great deal of confusion when reading sources online. Again, but we believe that context, not to censor, is the go-to move. So for example, this story was reported on Ground News by a few fringe sources. Readers who see this story on Ground News can see a few things. First off, they can see it's covered from just sources on the far right, which will give you that kind of context. Next, you'll see it's covered by sources who have a bad history of reporting with high factuality. And you also get a warning saying this story is just being covered by sources that do have a low factuality. So when readers can see the story on not Ground News, they can see these sources with that context. So we kind of, in a way, we see ourselves as the free market of news. Our solution isn't to be the arbiters of truth, but to help readers analyze news coverage through direct comparison. And we can only do this if we have a large variety of news sources. Readers should be given the chance to consume info with context. So who reads Ground News? Good question. We don't actually track who reads Ground News. We don't believe in a lot of those kind of implicit bias tracking that a lot of people in news use. And of course, we are nonpartisan. But of course, that doesn't stop us from being labeled. Some folks think that we lean right because we care about free speech. Some think that we lean left because we're based in Canada. But yeah, so who reads us? So I'd like you all to kind of give me a hand here. So we have this newsletter called the Blind Spot Report, where each week we have 6 blind spots, and we ask readers polls about questions related to the stories. 1 week we asked, do you support stricter voter ID laws? So by show of hands, who thinks that the pie chart on the left is the way that our audience answered? So show of hands on the left. Okay, cool. And now show of hands, who thinks that the pie chart on the right was the way that our audience answered? Okay, survey says the left. So they actually were more supportive of voter ID laws to be stricter. Next question. Do you think that the US is currently underestimating the cost of CO2? Hands up for who thinks that the pie chart on the left is correct. Chart on the left. And chart on the right. All right. Not bad, yeah, it was yes. So they did think that the readers of Ground News, or our readers did think that we are currently underestimating the cost of CO2. Last question, is it wrong for Texas to send migrants on buses to the north? Who thinks that our audience voted the chart on the left, yes, and who thinks that they voted no? So show of hands for left. All right, and show of hands for right. It was no, so they actually did support that initiative. So we don't, again, track our ideology of our audience, but we do think that we have a pretty diverse audience, at least in terms of their ideology. So the next question to ask is this working? We put a lot of trust in readers, but is this actually working out to a good outcome? So here's my favorite review that we've ever gotten from a reader, and I'll read it out. It's, I want to make an effort to hear from people I disagree with, to be forced to be uncomfortable, having my views challenged in the hopes of others doing the same, and start to bridge the divide. I'll be recommending Ground News to friends and foes alike. We've also been awarded App of the Day 5 times, have 1 million+ downloads on both the App Store and the Play Store, and have over 4.5 on both stores. So we're doing okay at the time. And lastly, despite the charts that I've shown you today, and the scary stuff you may see on Twitter, most Americans are still open to challenging their point of view and trying new ideas. And those people will always have a home on Ground News. Thank you. Any questions are welcome. You have to stand at the microphone. No worries. I think you were first, yeah.
My first question is about the left and right spectrum.
Yeah.
This is focusing on US, right? This is news catered to the US.
We actually are international,
Okay.
but about 70% of our audience is based in the US.
Okay. Is the far right, far left European far left, like far right and far left, or is it American, Republican, Democrat?
Yeah, good question. So the agencies that do the ratings, they are based in America, but they employ like a diverse set of reviewers in terms of like ideology, where they're from. So, but they also still do get a bit of an American centricness to it, and there also isn't really a way to put a source like RT on a American left-right spectrum, because like, you know, there's different points of view for laws and for rules. So to kind of answer your question, it is based on an international point of view, but it doesn't always translate directly to the US.
Thank you.
Yep, left.
Hi. So I have a lot of friends who, like most of us here, like, you know, dismiss sources as being biased. So this is a wonderful product to address that. But like you said, certain people also question whether you guys lean left or lean right. How do you convince people to use Ground News when they then question the bias of Ground News? How do you convince them that you guys are unbiased?
I guess in a way we don't. We don't have, like we have marketing, we work with a lot of people on YouTube, that's our main marketing channel right now is YouTubers and creators. But we're completely nonpartisan in the sense like we don't actually produce original content, and we don't have like, this like comms channel where we talk about stories, so we don't ever really opine on stories ourselves. So because of that, there isn't a lot of vectors that people can see us by and judge us by in terms of like what we actually produce. So we found that kind of like being quiet in that sense is better. And once they're on the product, they can see, okay, well, like they have all these sorts of sources, these stories, they're diverse, so they can kind of see themselves. So that's how we address that.
Sure. Thank you.
No worries. Yep.
Hello. First of all, I just want to commend you on the great work that you guys do. But
you.
my question kind of goes along with what he was asking. I want to know more about what are the strategies that you take. You have mentioned that you have a diverse workplace, but what are the strategies you take to make sure that you guys are not biased in sharing these sources, and how do you respond to critiques that you may have been biased in your reporting?
Yeah. I guess similar to the last question, like we do try to not give, or we just don't give our point of view on certain things. Like we do separate our work from the platform. Like I'm a human, I have biases, everyone here has biases. But the platform is designed in a way where we don't really give our original point of view on things. So we don't ever inject our personal bias into anything on the platform, which is, again, like, we're mostly a team of engineers. We have a few people who work for us in marketing, who used to be in journalism, and who used to be in that kind of area. But by design and by origin, we're mostly tech nerds and engineers. So we try to make this platform to be fully agnostic of like our point of view.
Thank you.
No worries. Yep.
Hi, first of all, again, wonderful product. I've been a long-time user and really a fan of what you guys have made there. I guess more just out of personal curiosity, you had mentioned that there was this idea that you want to incorporate maybe the seen as less reliable sources. And I was wondering what the internal conversation, because I mentioned there was one, within the founding members was like when you were talking about, do we include sources like Breitbart, like RT?
Yeah, probably the most interesting one was Russia, because that was now, 2.5 years ago when the invasion started. And people were obviously very upset, tensions were very high, and the EU acted kind of quickly in banning it. And so we chose to not ban it because it was more just like no action yet, and then we decided kind of on the line as we got more feedback. And then after the UK banned it, people because our second biggest base of users is actually in the UK, people were like, hey, I see that you still have RT, I'm going to call the authorities on you. I'm going to report you to Oxcom. I'm going to call the police. And we got like 3 or 4 of those DMs where it was like, I reported you to the British authorities, buckle up. So that never actually happened. They didn't do anything. But kind of the sense was, what would banning RT actually do practically? Like, whose mind would that change? Who would that benefit? And we kind of figured also it's like the war, as we thought would be a war, fought mostly online in terms of propaganda, as Russia tries to sway anti-West discord and Ukraine tries to sway support in their way. So we thought, okay, if we want our readers to be fully informed and resilient when they enter, stories beyond ground news, it'd be good if they could see what people in Russia are actually seeing. So like, you can step into the reality of a Russian in Russia by going on ground news and seeing that coverage. So the kind of thought there was banning it wouldn't sway any opinions, and by keeping it, people can better empathize with kind of the plight of Russians in Russia. So that's kind of the morale that led to that.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much.
No worries. Yep.
Hi, and thank you so much for being here. My question is, what has been like the hardest barrier to competing with like larger media and news outlets such as Fox or CNN?
Yeah, good question. Like one thing is like they're both billion-dollar companies. Like CNN is owned by I think Comcast, and Fox News is owned by News Corp, which have massive market caps. But also in a way, like they aren't really our competitor. CNN is more so cable. Fox News is also more so cable. So it's more like we have to convince people that there is a new way of reading news. Like the previous way of reading news, reading it from one source, it was kind of how people have read news the past decades, centuries. So it's more so the challenge is like, how do we convince them to build new habits? So it's like you see the story that may be biased, you say, okay, I want to read this from like multiple points of view. So the biggest thing was how do we cause that kind of change in habit versus more so where it's like they see us as similar to CNN and Fox News. It's like how do they adopt this new paradigm of reading news? So that's probably been the biggest challenge for us so far.
Thank you so much.
No worries. Yep.
How long has it been since people counted on one source for local news, say, the newspaper, and trusted it?
Sorry, how long has it been?
Yeah.
I mean, it's still happening today. I think that like the concept of like a news desert, unfortunately, there is a lot of places in America and also in Canada where there isn't a local paper to serve you. So if you're in a news desert, then it's not looking too good for you. But I think that a lot of people still trust local media. I don't have the chart here, but there's a chart that shows like what parts of the media people distrust and trust. And the lowest part is cable news. And then it's national news, and then actually pretty high, I think it's like 60-ish% trust their local paper. So there still is a lot of trust within a community member and their like local daily paper in that sense. So it still exists.
I'm so old, I started my journalism career as a newspaper reporter in a small town. And I covered it was a school board meeting. And one member of the board seemed to be being kind of a jerk. And I threw a little slap at him into my report. And as soon as the editor saw this, they distribute the papers before they went out. He called me up and said, "Don't you ever do that again." And I said, "Okay." And I did not. But I am finding myself, what you're proposing is people read all kinds of different sources to get something that doesn't try to tip them, and I respect that. But
Thank you.
honestly, I haven't voted for either presidential candidate in 2 elections now, and I'm not sure I'm voting in this one. Do you see that?
Do I see like a disengagement politically? Yeah, I think people.
Unwillingness to participate in these kind of silly conversations in many cases.
Yeah, I think people are checking out in a way. We actually have readers who left us for the election but are going to come back after. So I think there is people who are like that out there.
It may well be. Do you have a long-term plan for information we get online? We're talking about misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, all that stuff. Is that stuff calculable?
Yeah, it is a long term. We do want to be the default way to consume news, so that kind of is worked into those plans.
Okay.
Cool. And
thank you.
Sorry, or yes.
I just have a question about selection. How does the organization make a decision about what articles you're going to show? Because you could go all over the place and have tons. So how do you do that?
Yeah, we have pretty powerful ways to curate news. So I think on the average day, we curate around 85,000 sources or articles, which is grouped into a story. So all reporting on one topic goes into one story. And we sort that on a feed based off of mostly the size of coverage. So if a story has 400 articles about it, it'll usually go first. If a source has 250, it'll go second. So it's based mostly off of the size and the veracity of the reporting is how we kind of sort articles in that sense.
When you say veracity, how do you determine that?
We do bake, I believe, high factuality sources a bit more, so they carry a bit more weight in the coverage, so we don't just service always fringe stuff, so that does work into that calculation.
Thank you.
Problem. Cool. And I think we're out of time, unfortunately, but I'll be in the back room if you want to chat. I'm here all day. So, thank you.